Welcome to the Leftynet podcast. This is going to be the first episode in this podcast, and our first topic today is going to be about the newly announced 4,000 troops going into Afghanistan that General Mattis announced earlier this year. What do you guys think about that?
Well, actually, I haven't heard about it until now. What do you know about it?
So essentially, Mattis stated that because of the state of Afghanistan, uh, that we're going to be going back in and using the words "we're just getting started in Afghanistan," and placing an additional 4,000 troops after the reduction of troops was already ordered by the Obama administration earlier uh, in his presidency.
So 4,000 troops, that's quite a lot, right? I don't remember the exact.
Well, I
Um,
mean, there used to be more than 100,000 there, so compared to that,
100,000.
it's not that much.
Yeah, maybe it isn't a lot. So there actually used to be over
So
100,000.
to give you just an
One,
example, the current amount of American soldiers in Afghanistan currently is 10,000. So this will be roughly a 50% increase in troops.
So why is this, by the way, do you think? Um,
Well, one reason is because Trump gave the authority to decide these troop levels over to the generals, so they're just doing whatever they want now.
oh, all right. Yeah, he's very hard to predict, in my opinion. Um, Recently, in the G20 summit, they actually made a ceasefire agreement where they said that um, I'm not sure who this was directed to, but they made a handshake, or Trump more specifically made a handshake with Putin and agreed to a ceasefire. And now, for some reason, they backed out of it. So there's practically no ceasefire since this was directed towards, well, Trump's or like the US military. So I guess they're all good to go to re-enter Syria again. It's quite a
I saw some,
confusing scenario.
excuse me, go on.
Also,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, I do believe as of 2016, I might be wrong here, over 50% of Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban.
no, you're right about that. I
So,
do remember, like, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, um, the United States was building a long-term NATO base, so I wouldn't be really surprised if that they announced that
yeah,
they're
so
staying
there's
for the long
over
term.
50% of Afghanistan is now controlled by the Taliban. Um, and that means that there will be 14,000 troops in Afghanistan. I think, what was it? It was going to be like 2,000, 3,000 troops in Kuwait. And then currently the US has 1,400 or 400 ground troops in Syria, advising and training the Kurds, as well as helping in the siege for Raqqa.
Don't they also have a few troops in the south near the Jordanian border?
Yes, they do have a few troops in the south Jordanian border. I do believe they're stationed in Israel, but they might be stationed in Jordan. Recently, they crossed the border to assist rebels in repelling an ISIS attack, which stirred a lot of media outcry, not realizing that these events are very common and that the convoy that they sent was a relatively small one in proportion to what they have historically sent.
Yeah, but then a bit later, a Syrian army column got a bit close, and then they got bombed because they were too close to the rebels and their American advisors.
Apparently, there's some reporting I heard that America has already pulled out of the ceasefire. This is coming
Yeah,
from Maoist rebel news. I'm not sure how reliable it is.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, there was definitely something weird going on in the G20 summit. But besides, like, the responses was not just about the G20 summit and the political um, well, consequences of that, but I noticed there was a huge protest during that thing too, the G20, and it's not just been from that summit. It's been massive amounts of protest all around in Europe, like this year. Partly, well, the Berkeley events, which was with Antifa, but there's also been protests against austerity in Greece, massive protests and very violent protests in Venezuela, and there's just overall political chaos going on in some parts in Europe. And one thing that I'm particularly curious about is that I do not see much of this. Took quite a while for me to get around this information. It was just a couple of days ago that I talked to a Greek guy on another, well, a small little podcast we held, and he told me about, well, pretty much a lot of the people in the sanitary part of the one of the industries in Greece, which handle a lot of the garbage, went on a strike, and I think it was over 10,000 or something that was dismissed by the Greece government, and well, obviously that had a lot of complications, but there seems to be this uproar amongst many, well, many parts of European countries' populations, and especially in leftist countries. Not to mention like the protests during the elections. Like maybe not so much in Britain, but definitely in France. If you remember that, after well Macron was elected, and just before that too, people were not happy with the results. So I don't know. Have you guys noticed all of these protests, and what are your reactions to it? Like, is it
No,
more
actually,
than?
I haven't noticed any protests. What are you talking about?
Well, I mean, like
Just kidding.
besides
Just
the
kidding.
yeah, I know it's just a joke, but like it's kind of true to some extent too. I have not necessarily found this firsthand on Twitter or whatever. This is mainly because I was interested in it. What I've been seeing more publicly is, the drama of CNN. There was apparently some guy who made this, well, video of
Yeah,
Donald Trump
the
knocking out
GIF or
someone.
video.
Yeah, it was a GIF, I think, and people were outraged by it.
Yeah,
And since
that's what you
Donald
get for
Trump
looking on
retweeted it
Twitter,
on his
though.
Twitter, yeah, that's true. Well, there's probably something that I personally think is not a problem necessarily, but I find it a lot hard to find good sources of information that are, well, um, some place where I can just really feel, okay, here's a good spot where it's not cluttered up by a lot of other things that I'm not interested in. And it's not so much that there's not good sources on these platforms. It's just these platforms in general. I mean, Twitter has always been kind of a bad way to discuss topics due to its like very short nature of just like 140 characters or something. You can't really have good debates on it or good discussions.
So,
But
going
yeah,
back to your point about protests in light of
yeah,
recent events, I definitely have seen noticeable protests. Not necessarily many protests, but the ones that have happened are noticeable. I think we were all expecting a G20 summit protest out of Hamburg, but I don't think anybody was expecting the level of protest and riots that we had. Um, for example, the idea of blocking off streets and essentially, literally having cops lose control over parts of the city. I think that these protests and these recent events have sparked riots that, as of late, we haven't really seen in comparison. Even in places
Is
like
is that really true though? I mean, weren't there the Seattle riots back in the day, or wherever was it, where they had the one
Excuse
big,
me.
very
Yeah,
famous protest?
apparently the protesters blocked off Trump's wife Melania
yeah,
from going to, which is fucking awesome. Like,
yeah,
I
also
didn't.
there's like some fucking nepotism. Like, we essentially elected a dynasty into the White House
Oh yeah, that's a good
because
point.
Trump's daughter Ivanka fucking sat in for him at the meeting.
Well, also, well, me personally, I was surprised that the police did lose control of areas, but I'm also surprised how quickly um everything just grew, you know?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
And
definitely it definitely grew fast, and it definitely grew to extraordinary levels. To the point of the infamous 20,000 reinforcements being ordered from Berlin
wow,
to
it's
help.
crazy.
So in total, there were 50,000 active riot officers and police officers in Hamburg, night of G20, to hold protesters and to manage the city. Even with this increase, with 50,000, you still had parts of the city that were uncontrolled by police officers.
yes, this situation kind of reminds me of what happened in Madrid a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Now imagine this happening in America. It's practically impossible.
Also, I think an event that has really gone unspoken or talked about in as of late has to be Brazil's Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister Lula, who was essentially removed from power, got a 10-year sentence for corruption and has been jailed.
What?
Yeah.
Was it well deserved? I didn't follow it.
Um.
It's it's a socialism of 21st century South American country, so I will assume that it was deserved.
So who
I
is
mean, if
like
everyone
who
is
are
corrupt and you're just arresting a few people, it's basically using these things as a political weapon. So even if
yeah,
he
that's
was
a good point.
corrupt, it's still a hatchet job in a way.
Oh yeah, of course. But Lula actually presented an interesting case. So before Lula, when Lula was elected, uh, essentially, he started a movement of many Brazilians, specifically young Brazilians, outing themselves as democratic socialists under the guise of following Lula's characteristics and policies. So pre-Lula, there was obviously socialist people, but post-Lula, the numbers grew. Uh, and then going into claiming to be socialist, and then going into social groups and actually radicalizing.
Well, I mean, that's quite different from Europe. Like when I look at Europe, I see the opposite trend. People who claim to be socialists and then go into, like, at least bureaucratically and parliamentarily, going into what looks to be social democracy. Uh, I'm not really talking about Mélenchon here or, or well, Labour Party. I'm actually more talking about not even Syriza at this point, due to, well, it's very hard to run that country. I'm more talking about Albania and other countries where they seem to have a majority, but yet under their policies, they remain like socially democratic. While they could run some sort of a communist socialist platform, this idea of a Euro communism, is there actually any like substance to it at all, or are these countries just, well, accepting that communism is dead in the Western society and that social democracy is the new way to go to gain political power in these countries? What do you guys think?
Well, regarding political powers as socialists, you of course have notable things like Syriza, the KKE,
Oh yeah.
and other places. But I think another place that has gone unrecognized when it comes to their socialist and communistic party has to be Cyprus,
Oh yeah, definitely.
with four
Yes, yes.
out of 470 municipal councils, 123 are held by the Progressive Party of Working People, their communist party. They hold 2/6 of their European Parliament, and 16 out of their 56 House of Representatives.
Yeah,
Didn't
What
they
was
also
we,
have the
that's because
presidency at some point?
they have basically been abandoned by the Eurozone, Cyprus.
Yeah, surprisingly though, while Greek remains in an economic recession, Cyprus has turned its economy around, and sadly enough, there's no end in sight for the Turkish Cyprus ordeal with northern Cyprus.
Yeah, and speaking of Turkey, of all countries, with Erdogan pretty much becoming the dictator of that country after the referendum, we do see a lot of refugees returning also, apparently. According to the UN, about, I think it's around 400,000 or up to 500,000 of these refugees are returning home. So it's a very confusing situation where the conflict in Syria seems to be still at large, and
Yeah,
It is
it's
winding
weird.
down.
It is
yeah,
winding
In like the
down.
most populated places, the civil war has been over for a while now.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so. Regarding the referendum, interesting enough. So, 85% of Turkey's economy and 71% of, or and 85% of all books produced, voted in favor of or against the referendum. But Erdogan's power does not. That referendum does not take effect until 2024 or 2023 when elections
Oh,
start. So
I didn't know that.
yeah, so until 2023, everything's going to relatively stay the same. Um, and essentially, how that's going to go down is like other places how have gone down with enacting policy changes to increase term length and things like that. Or at least that's what I predict will happen. He obviously can't do anything too outrageous, as we saw extreme riots in Ankara and Istanbul.
I think we're seeing
Yeah.
like a Putin sort of situation here, where he
Oh, yeah.
swaps between prime minister and president all the time.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you're right, actually.
the president role of Turkey is majority ceremonial, holding like little to no power. So,
Yeah, but like that's the point. The the power shifts from president to prime minister as
well,
Putin changes his position.
oh yeah, and currently, uh, Erdogan is both prime minister and president, I think.
Right.
Well, like,
These titles don't really matter. It's the whole apparatus behind Erdogan is the way in which his AKP party controls the society. That's where he derives his power. As long as that isn't dealt with, he can give himself whatever title he wants, or even not have one at all and still run the country.
Oh yes, to correct myself, the prime minister of Turkey is Binali Yildirim.
hmm.
I
Since
have
2016.
I have heard that Erdogan has praised the political power that the amount of political power that Hitler had. I think
Wow.
Well,
But
that's
he
I'm
post
not
thought
sure.
it wasn't enough.
referendum in 2023, I believe. Um,
No, I think that was actually before that. I will post the
hmm.
source.
Oh, interesting. But yeah, I think an also interesting thing regarding Turkey is the fact that the border attacks on Rojava as of late, all of them being repelled and all of them resulting in a Turkish defeat. But there have been numerous skirmishes and fights on the border between Turkey and Rojava.
Do you have any other like news on Rojava? I haven't been updated on it for quite a
Yeah,
while.
so Rojava, what's going on now is that in the Siege of Raqqa, as the main news, the Siege of Raqqa, they've managed to take all external neighborhoods. They've managed to push them out of the general area, and they've essentially boxed the center of Rojava in, or not Rojava, the center of Raqqa in. Um, ISIS no longer has access to the Euphrates River, um, and
I
they're
have
essentially
heard there's I have heard there's been some flocking and displacement of civilians that were running away from the YPG because of force conscription. Is this true? What do you guys think?
I don't really know about that, but I do know numerous people who were fleeing the chaos of Raqqa have been shot
Yeah,
or were
that's
shot
probably
by
just people fleeing the front line, basically.
yeah, but I do know that there have been people who were fleeing via boats have been shot by coalition airplanes. I think that's just misidentification, though.
Yeah, probably. You know, um, I heard some talk about corruption earlier, and like always, leftist countries, obviously, they're going to be labeled as corrupted, all the leaders, but especially in Africa, there is always some truth to it. But when I look at some of the other countries, and well, not technically maybe a part of Europe, but when I look at Russia, for example, and even Turkey as well, looking at this democracy index from The Economist, there's certain factors like is there free press? Can you legally vote? I mean, you can technically legally vote in North Korea as well, but when they measure this, both Turkey and well, especially Russia, come up in like the third, like in from a 0 to 10 they are in like a 3 or something, and they've always been very like flawed. They've never been a like true democracy. And I'm actually kind of curious, well, you said something earlier about uh well, Turkey and well, Erdogan approaching some kind of a Putin situation where they're shifting between like the president and the prime minister. Like a lot of these things go pretty unnoticed, I feel, and I don't really, you know, subconsciously from what I hear from the media or whatever, I don't really label them as some sort of a regime. But looking at all of the facts and like even comparing them to more well socialist areas in maybe Africa, a lot sometimes I even see him to be more corrupt, especially like looking at the referendum. From what I understand, it was highly tampered with the results, and like in Russia as well, like that is the primary example of like elections being tampered with, and there's been like evidence from its looking at the CCT cameras or the cameras, seeing how they like purposefully well they did not count it properly, and they have all of these like very convoluted systems that make the democratic process even slower but also more prone to faults. And I've seen all of these uh, well oppositions rise up in maybe Russia that are maybe either more left leaning or more liberal, but I never
I
hear
would say
about them.
the oppositions in Russia are basically are controlled opposition. I wouldn't say they're genuine. The
So
Communist Party is filled with like Russian Orthodox nationalists and shit.
Yeah. Also, when you
Yeah,
refer to socialist countries in Africa, I think it's pretty important to specify which, as
oh yeah.
India has its preamble in its constitution both asserts that it's socialist as well as Bangladesh.
Yeah, I never really considered them to be that. Like, it's not something
And
that.
and well, obviously
Yeah.
they're not African, but just as an example, also Tanzania also has um, socialism in
But
its
a lot of
country.
that is just holdovers from the Cold War. It's artifacts. They don't stand for anything substantial anymore.
Oh yeah, of course, but I
yeah,
think that's
exactly.
the point. Is that
Yeah,
the
I was actually listening to um, a debate yesterday where it was a debate between leftist content creators on YouTube, like Zerchaji, which we mostly call Muke, and Bad Mouse Productions, another leftist YouTuber, and another guy called the Finnish Bolshevik, and they were going up against Sargon of Akkad, and some academic philosopher and a CEO of a company or an executive of a company. And what struck me, like, well, obviously there's other things that I like to criticize, like the rhetorics, and like how
the
they
fact
did
that it isn't
debate.
just a Finnish Bolshevik talking for 3 hours,
Oh
that would
yeah,
have
that
been an
too.
improvement.
But one thing that I looked at some of the criticisms. I didn't bear myself to watch the entire debate. I watched a bit of it, but I talked to some other people on Discord that are more in contact with these people, and what they said, it was kind of interesting actually. Listening to Zekji's opinion about how it went and like his followers, and maybe even Bad Mouse too. They said it went pretty good from their point of view. Obviously, the right wingers having more of the popular side on their side, would say it went pretty well for them. But I even heard like more of these well well-read and maybe more rhetorically developed people say that it went horribly. And me myself, like, kind of anticipating the debate. I didn't actually expect it to go very well, but I was really disappointed by uh, not only their like how they referred to certain like I think it was the Finnish Bolshevik. They referred to uh, Soviet Union or and some other like current countries as socialist or something. I mean, not Soviet as a current
Yeah.
country, but
I also I'd like talking about the debate.
I
I
mean,
myself was
but it's a battle they couldn't have won anyway. They're literally going up against professionals, like
yeah,
Sargon and that other fuckhole. It's literally their job to do what they do, and the other guys
yeah,
just do it
exactly.
after hour.
I'd like to say that actually watching the podcast, it's it's not it went horribly, not for the reason that they were up against professionals, but for the reason that they couldn't refute basic points.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
they overlook the most
So
basic
I'd
attacks against
like to
commerce.
point out,
I'm
um,
not, I'm not saying I would
Bantu.
do any better.
Oh, but no, to point out. So Bantu brought up how the market is completely, unstable, right? And that it's organic, and that you won't be able to predict it, and that you can only predict it now. He also said after that the market was completely stable and you could predict it. Zizzy not only overlooked this, but once he started back to saying, "Oh, that it's unorganic or it's organic and you can't predict it," Zizzy gave him the point by then defending that it is absolutely predictable and stable.
I know, but
Um,
Yeah,
just
guys,
that's
you
basic
can
debate
use a Dell
strategies and
computer.
everything.
I'd also like also regarding many other of their attempts, they failed to pick up on basic points and refutations, especially about markets and the actual definition of socialism and
Yeah,
things like that.
really, what bothered me the most isn't perhaps, well, obviously that their inability to point out these very basic points, which I also heard from the more maybe uh, well-read theoreticians on some other discords that I frequent. But it was a general like also their like choice of people to debate with. My general problem is that I don't feel these people, these individuals on the left, was necessarily a good representation of the vast majority of people, like on the radical left of the internet. And I would say like Sargon of Akkad is a much more good representation of perhaps right wingers in the sense that most people are liberals.
But I
Honestly, the way they
But it's
represented us, it isn't really half as bad because most of us are just degenerate fucks.
well,
yeah, that's
I'd
true.
like to point out that
Speak for yourself, man.
um, but no, I'd like to point out that even regarding how they weren't a good representation, if you look at the socialist or not the socialist, the capitalist side, they had a very diverse audience that you couldn't
Oh
really take or to refute anybody. I mean, Bantu was a startup businessman. Sargon does this for a living. An academic agent obviously
Yeah,
knows how to
exactly.
argue. Um, while you have a cast of people who are well known for not necessarily being anywhere near a good representation. You've had
They're,
this
they're
issue with
not
Zizzy in the
they're not even
past.
well known in a big sense.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, they're well known in our niche, but beyond that, nobody knows them.
Yeah,
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 definitely.
it's basically a WWE with e-celebs.
Oh.
Like, it's useless. It didn't convince
Yeah.
any side.
Yeah.
but not to
And they
Honestly,
mention,
invite guys just to lose.
we should avoid this.
not to mention by with what I think the real issue that you had here was, it seemed like a majority of the questions were extremely biased in favor of the capitalists. Um, for
Yeah, that too.
example, one of the questions was like, has socialism worked in the past and can it? Another question was, is Venezuela socialist? And then
Oh yeah, definitely.
the first two questions were just basic philosophical ones that either side could pick up on. Um, not to mention that the moderator went well over time for capitalists numerous times and was very strict
Hey,
Oh,
about
yeah.
he was
letting.
very easy on the left in the beginning, though.
Yeah,
So,
he was very easy. But
so
Who
yeah,
organized the thing? Like which
uh,
party?
that's a good question,
All
actually.
the
I think it was
strings.
mutual between Zizzy and Sargon.
Yeah, I think I saw them at a bar or something.
Yeah.
They apparently had a meetup,
Didn't they
and maybe
meet at
they.
like a VidCon or whatever?
They
Something
Yeah, I
met,
like a
think so.
YouTube convention.
but yeah, I mean, you had. I think yeah. So the major issue was that not only were the questions biased, and you really didn't have a good representation, and you had people who were known throughout the right-wing community and did this for a living and had a diverse cast. Um, but you also really there was little to no actual chance for the left side to put in anything meaningful.
Yeah,
With with the uh, with the things that they had.
I
yeah,
mean, so here's the thing. The leftist side was Nuke, who is a physics student. So
yeah.
obviously he doesn't know much about rhetorics. You have a Finnish guy, which, like, I can tell myself, it's not really hard. It's not really easy to articulate your
Definitely not.
point on the
Yeah,
spot.
you did have
And you
an
had bad
extreme language
mouths.
barrier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what are you saying, Rob?
But like what I meant about misrepresentation isn't necessarily the people or their personal beliefs. They did quite well introduce their beliefs in the beginning, like what their ideology was pretty much, and there was quite some variance. But what bothered me was that it didn't appear as if what they were saying represented their own opinions, and when they said things, it just kind of slipped out and either in being misinterpreted by the right wingers, or that they somehow rhetorically manipulated the situation in order to come out as well the winner of the arguments. And I'm not saying that necessarily they have the that they're not intelligent enough or that they're not well read enough to
Isn't that
understand
just
these
debating
things.
experience?
Yeah, and that's another thing, which is probably my biggest issue with like debates in general. Personally, I like to see more discussions rather than debates, but it's more. I don't think a lot of people have access to actually have a good way with words. Generally, it's something that you passively develop for most people. Maybe you read, which will increase your ability, but there are quite a lot of good resources to
Which, of
develop
course,
that
was a
ability.
problem for Muke.
Definitely, and it was quite. Yeah, he was really put in a corner. So I don't even think he was expecting to be talking for most of the time either. But
By the way, is my audio shit, or
It's pretty
it's
decent.
pretty.
like,
It's decent.
is it bearable?
It's,
Okay.
it's good
Bearable.
enough.
It's bearable.
Um,
But I think it's not just a debate or anything. I have my criticism of YouTube, but one thing that I like to signify is the importance of being able to articulate yourself. It's not always necessarily about having good rhetorics or being well read on a subject. What matters most is that if you can represent your opinion, you can't really lose if if your intention is to learn or either like maybe even persuade your opponent if you have valid reasons to believe those opinions. But
Well, the main thing is you have to be charismatic.
yeah, maybe like,
Or
but
just
I'm
know how
not
to
sure.
speak well. It's a skill you have to learn.
It is a skill that you have to learn, and also there one thing that you'd point out in that particular debate, they're much younger, so this passive buildup of a way with words and rhetorical ability is limited in comparison to maybe the CEO and Sargon of Akkad
No,
that has done
those are big things. I mean,
yeah,
people
and I
like
think
CEOs, they live by bullshitting people all day long, just make themselves seem necessary.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I like the only way to really build it up, I think, is to not only talk to other people who maybe are more experienced than yourself, but also talk to people of the opposite side, so you can develop that ability to argue and debate for your I'm not even sure debate is the best word here. It's more again being
Dialogue.
able to dialogue, being able to articulate yourself, to have a substantial conversation with your counterpart. Like they actually have to say this in newspapers. I find it so mind blowing. You know, when they said, "Well, when you talk to a Trump person, really try to understand them." Like there's all these like tricks, like seek first to understand and try to general empathy, but it's not so much I think that we need to understand each other's opinions. Like and maybe I don't want to understand these opinions. Maybe I do disagree with them completely, but I think a lot of the problems actually comes with not being able to understand what you're saying. And what I mean by that is that often when people talk, maybe they don't even mention what they want to say, but it's often like the information slips out in rhetoric play. Like you can completely manipulate your opponent's position by asking questions that are first of all maybe logically not flawed, but makes it unable to it's a loaded question pretty much. Like is
But
Venezuela
the only
a socialist
counteroffensive to
country?
that is
Yeah.
to have like the skill and the daring to just plow your way through that using maybe even fallacious arguments yourself,
Yeah.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
humor or exaggerations.
But no, just to put in a few words. I mean, I completely agree. I also feel like um, the debates in this fashion do not work well, especially for the cast that you had. Um, I found that listening to the right wing side of it, you had much more, a lot more aspects of loaded questions. And,
Oh yeah, definitely.
like, for example, Bantu. When Zizzy was talking about uh, like capitalist motivations. I think it was Finnish Bolshevik actually. Um, Bantu Bantu immediately responded with, "Oh well, do you know my motivations as a capitalist?" Or and just things like that that nobody could answer without being absolutely incorrect.
I mean, he did Bantu did bullshit quite a lot. He said that his motivation is to provide a product, which never is true. His motivation is just to generate profit.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean,
And
both
I
parts
don't
were so.
think, like, I haven't watched the entire debate. I didn't have
Nah, me
the
neither.
the will to,
Yeah.
but I think the leftist side did pretty good on the question: is society a collection of human experience or a conspiracy of those in power, or something like that? Something to that effect.
Oh, is society a result of collective human experience or tailored by society's elites?
That's such a
Yeah, yeah,
pointless
yeah.
question.
I actually
I
want
think
to.
it is a pointless question because I think both sides would be in agreement here.
Yeah, not to mention that it's literally just like, what's the point in debating that? There's
Yeah,
Yeah,
just,
it is a
just give
myth. It
concrete
is a
things
it
which would
is
be
a
different and debate that.
yeah.
like I
it
hardly
is.
even
I think
understand some of these questions.
it is clear that a person who doesn't know that much about Marxism has made this has made those questions because like like the Marxist analysis, we do not need to make conspiracy theories. We just see the world as it is and draw conclusions from it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Marxism is a lot more about criticizing and analyzing capitalism rather than this, replacing it with a
No,
socialist
not
system.
just capitalism, more society in
Yeah,
general.
society, definitely.
Zizzy actually brought that point up. He said
Yeah,
that when referring to Marx, you have to realize that the critique of capitalism and communism in general is more of a.
You dropped out.
yeah, he definitely referred to.
Oh yeah, no. So as I was saying, uh,
You're gonna have to repeat that whole part. You
oh
dropped out.
yes. So as I was saying, you had oh fuck, I can't remember what I was talking about.
No, no, no.
You were
He said,
talking
Something
about
about
how, in the respect of Marx, you have
Oh
to.
yeah. So in the respect of Marx, communism as an idea is much more about the critique of capitalism than it is actually building of a separate ideology.
Yeah, Marx very rarely talks about communism. He
Yeah,
mostly critiques capitalism. The one book where he
Definitely not.
talks about it is a small fucking 10-page paper, The Critique of the Gotha Program.
yeah. I feel yeah.
That's the only.
Zizzy made that very clear early on. But he failed to really push that every time he was pressured about communism as an ideology from.
yeah, what's funny? I feel what is the intention for like the debate? Is it to because clearly it's not necessarily to persuade your opponent. I mean, you're destined to lose against that competition. Is it to gain viewership? Is it to gain popularity? Is it to I don't
All
even
of
like
those
show
things,
the
I think.
audience? Yeah, but
But
then
it's not a bad thing that they do it. I mean, they get some exposure, they get some
yeah,
practice, which they obviously need.
yeah, that is good in itself, but it's not as a viewer, it's not very refreshing at all. It's kind of disappointing, especially if you know a bit about it. Um, and I really have to like when I go onto Twitter and I listen to like the same debates, they're much more thorough, and it's mainly because you really have to limit what you're saying on Twitter. But a lot of these like faults really come to display on these other platforms since you are limited to a certain amount of words and characters. You use pictures and memes to ridicule your opponent, and I see these people do it all the time. It's kind of entertaining and to some extent, but it's also quite interesting to see how much people use like strawman arguments to make a point come across. And like
Yeah, that they only have
obviously,
memes, but they don't have anything underneath that. That's just all the argument they have.
well, there is ideology, but when I listen to like what was it, something that Sargon said in the beginning of the debate, like I'm a Marxist, I'm a Marxist Sargonist or something. Is quite funny because when he says on Twitter discussions and send it quite a lot, yeah, I've read Marx. It doesn't say anything. Like I have read books, but clearly it's not about understanding these topics or whatever. It's just
Yeah, Sargon claims that he has read all 3 volumes of Das Kapital.
Yeah, he definitely hasn't.
that that's
Yeah,
kind of funny. Like I'm not sure if they necessarily disagree with all of the points or if they
I
don't
mean,
understand.
like, yeah, they don't understand them. If he has read it, he would just be reading plain words. He might as well have been like reading rereading a fucking children's book all the time,
Well,
because
If
yeah,
you actually read it, you would
Ca-
be an
to
actual
understand
Marxist.
Capital, you have to have previously read Hegel,
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I mean,
which
I
I
actually
don't think
heard,
Sargon has done, because he's like
yeah,
an analytical
I don't
kind of
think.
guy
I think
rather
also
than
a good point to bring up when referring to the lack of knowledge from the right wing side, is that although they did have a lack of knowledge, they were willing to pressure points. While
oh
the
yeah,
left side realized that the left side also really didn't have an understanding of the right wing points, but were afraid to keep on pushing them.
yeah. That was one thing I also thought about yesterday is that they were much more confident, maybe because they're more experienced, but also because they're not in the minority. The left side was definitely in the minority, but
they're not beta cucks.
And they don't, and they felt more secure. They didn't have to, worry about stepping on somebody else's toes.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
And they
quite
had
funny.
the conviction. They had the conviction of their beliefs,
Oh yeah,
unlike the
You
leftist side.
also you also had a very active participation from all three members of the right wing side. When it came to the left wing side, it was 99% Muke and Finnish
yeah, definitely.
Bolshevik, while Badmouse was quite silent.
Yeah, which is always a good sign when Yuke is constantly talking.
But yeah, I also feel like yeah, they were much more unified ideologically. You didn't have to worry about
Oh yeah.
stepping on anybody's toes. Um, you also really didn't, because although they knew their points were childish and wrong, once again they were willing to pressure them and to make them have to give answers to them. While the left side failed to do that, they failed to give out points
Oh,
that they could pressure
plus,
them on.
they have a fairly unified program of leftism and more or less status quo, while the left side had three people belonging to three different ideological leftist sects. How can they even
Yeah.
form a united front if they don't first coordinate their opinions on a few
You
issues?
know, I actually
Yeah.
had a discussion yesterday about, well, not only the whole reading but not retaining. Apparently, I've talked to some people whose friends have read a bunch of books like Hegel, Karl Marx, but have very, very low retention. And I'm not sure whether or not it's like the lack of exposure to this more advanced like terminology, or if we're just looking for the wrong things when we're reading or when we're listening to people. First of all, like, maybe it's not that people do not have the ability to understand this, maybe they're looking for the wrong things, like especially in the arguments. That's probably one thing that I think held, well, the left side back the most. The points were very simple, but they didn't manage to snap it up or commented on it. And I think also, like, the whole, which is another point, like left sectarianism. I'm not saying intersectionalism is something that is necessarily good or bad. Definitely within identity politics, it's not something that we necessarily cherish. But when I see this concept of, like left unity, some sort of a European communism, um, I don't see people being educated. That is probably one of the biggest, like,
Yeah,
when it
sure.
comes.
But if you're
Yeah.
gonna debate a panel of status quo dregs of
Yeah,
society, at least on the people you put on the other side, let them have a
yeah, that
united opinion.
exactly, that too. But I think it's also, even though they might have misrepresented some
I
opinions
mean,
by either,
leftism is just inherently prone to sort of
Um,
ideological balkanization.
so
yeah,
regarding your comment about the retention level of people, I think the reason why it's hard to have a debate with leftists is that most of the points regarding Marx and Hegel would take far too long to explain to somebody who doesn't have previous knowledge of them. And with the 15-minute time that they had for a free forum, it wasn't enough. You wouldn't have enough time to in-depthly explain these points in a way that would be suitable for a debate. Um, for example, explaining a key aspect of capital in depth and giving refutations and everything, it would take vastly longer and would take a good sum of time out of that forum than actually refuting points or raising counter
Yeah, but
arguments.
that's why you can't do those things in a debate. That's what you do in
Yeah.
dialogues and lectures and those kind of things. But if you're going to a debate, you just have to go with your knife drawn and think of nothing else.
Exactly. It was kind of funny actually hearing, I think it was Muke who said like he was going to mention something from Capital, and he always mentioned all of these like articles, and he didn't mention where they came from until he was asked to. But what struck me interesting was that he said he was going to mention some part in Karl Marx, and they said, no, I can't mention that because it's too advanced, or something like that. It takes too long to delve into. And, when you say that, you kind of come across as a fool, as you sort of expect, well, people should know this is obvious. And I can't use this as an example, but it would prove you wrong. Like, a lot of these points, I think, could be made a lot more simpler, and you would not have to have a lot of these misunderstandings. I think the point is,
That's hard if you want to boil down complex ideas into a
yeah,
good talking
Yeah,
point. That's
exactly. So maybe these debates are not
I think it
impossible,
would be
but
more useful to have debates between more hardline social democrats or
yeah,
democratic socialists who know their shit,
exactly,
and
exactly.
then slowly convince people further and further into the rabbit hole of leftist
Yeah.
thinking.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how much people listening to this are retaining. I mean, uh, there's a lot of chaos going on in the world, like information wise. And I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I myself have a hard time looking at good sources. And the sources that I do find seem lackluster. If it's debates, if it's people that I watch on YouTube, it doesn't seem very reliable. Maybe Andre be an example. So, what do I suggest to people that maybe can relate to those emotions? Well, there are a ton of, well, books, obviously. You can read a bunch of PDF files. There are a lot of good tools that help you both read faster, but also save notes. But like something as complex as rhetorics in general, there are a lot of good free resources. You can even get like one free month Audible account. Maybe read a way with words, which I did. Like it's very all of these concepts are sort of simple. It's about having direction and what you want to learn, what types of information you are looking for. If you go onto a site like Twitter or YouTube, it's mostly going to be filled up with with entertainment and like people posting memes. And when I argue with people, and I guess this is the case for many people too, people tend to argue in a more funny way. I guess I had an example where I had to argue with a Nazi, and the whole conversation can pretty much be summed up in "you're a cuck," and what I said was, "No, your opinions are spooks, or you are attached to some very abstract, arbitrary point about, um, you know, German, well, like German identity, and it was very all over the place. And when I listen to debates, it is very all over the place, a lack of direction, and the points are very simple.
I think
But
so. Regarding how you are talking about the lack of decent resources
yeah,
in main usage, I think a majority is to the widespread need for edutainment.
yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
you can't really appeal to an audience on these platforms without making some sort of humor with them, which
Exactly.
leads
no,
to an
you
overall dead
you
grid.
can, but then you're talking about things like lectures. You can find those things on
Yeah,
YouTube, and they're very useful. But if you're
there
talking about
are.
current events kind of type things, not much on there on that kind of
Yeah,
platform.
and you
Yeah.
you
Well, I think
can't.
Slavoy does a good job of entertaining the audience while giving lectures. I could listen
Yeah,
to
I think
him
so.
for hours.
Yeah,
To
Uh,
whom?
Slavoj.
Slavoy.
Oh, of course.
Well,
He has the
so
perfect formula. It's theory, dirty joke, theory, dirty joke. He rewards you every
yeah,
now
I
and
find
then.
Yeah,
him very entertaining
just to keep you
myself.
interested, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. He actually released a book recently to maybe close things off. I could read the description of his latest book, The Courage of Hopelessness, Chronicles of a Year Acting Dangerously, which I think is a accurate
Yeah,
description of the current year.
I'm reading that one
Um,
currently.
in these troubled
So
times, yeah,
that was about 2011, I think, the
yeah,
year
Is it,
that
exactly.
Came in
what kind of
dangerously.
style is it written in? Is it like the direct style, like his refugee book, or more like his theoretical works?
It's
Um,
more like his theoretical works, which I
yeah,
do find
exactly.
more difficult to read because the direct book, like there's this direct style that I read also a few weeks ago. I finished it. It's What Does Europe Want in collaboration with Srećko Horvat, and I think that that was a really easy and good read, and I do recommend it.
What was a good and easy read?
What Does Europe Want? It talks about the Greek crisis and the elections.
Hmm.
It does make some really bad assumptions about Syriza, especially when you see how it turned out,
Oh, yeah.
like the whole Syriza
What
thing.
did he get wrong?
Well, he got wrong that Syriza will stop imposing austerity measures, and that Syriza will be some sort of a new wave that
Oh, yeah.
will
That's
We all
sort
got
of
that wrong.
yeah.
strengthen the European left.
The latest protest in Greece was actually the people protesting against austerity measures once again. It was quite a big protest as well.
Yeah,
And
I think
of
Yanis
course,
Varoufakis, who was the Minister of Economy
oh yeah,
in Greece, actually broke with Syriza and resigned. I think it was
yeah,
recently,
yeah. I listened to
No,
and
now I get why.
he started his own movement, which I
yeah.
don't
He's
know if a lot of people know about. It's Democracy in Europe 25.
oh, and actually didn't heard about that.
No,
I
Yeah,
listened to
Varoufakis, he's the good guy in all of this. He's like
yeah, he's a good.
in his speeches and
yeah.
such, he's
I listened to one of his
real
TED
good.
talks. I'm not sure exactly what it was called, but
The
he
founding members are him, Srećko Horvat, and some of the more
oh
prominent members include Zizek and even
oh yeah,
Chomsky.
exactly. But
So
I mean, yeah, like the best source if you really want to, because that should be the main goal, I think, if you are interested in, well, learning about leftism is the whole purpose is education, and there are a lot of good writers out there, even though it seems kind of hopeless. And one of these writers are then, I would say personally, and I think some of you also would agree, would be Slavoj Žižek. So reading the description of his latest book, The Courage of Hopelessness, says, in these troubled times, even the most pessimistic diagnosis of our future ends with an uplifting hint that things might not be as bad as at all, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Yet, argues Slavoj Žižek, it is only when we have to admit to ourselves that the situation is completely hopeless, that the light at the end of the tunnel is in fact the headlight of the approaching train coming to us from the opposite direction. That fundamental change can be brought about, surveying the various challenges in the world today, from mass immigration and geopolitical tensions to terrorism, the explosion of rightist populism, and the emergence of new radical politics, all of which, in their own way, express the impasses of global capitalism. Zizek explores whether there still remains the possibility of genuine change. Today, he proposes that the only true question is, or should be, this: do we endorse the predominant acceptance of capitalism as a fact of human nature, or does today's capitalism contain strong enough antagonisms to prevent its infinite reproduction? Can we, he asks, move beyond the failure of socialism and beyond the current wave of populist rage and initiate radical change before this train hits? So I thought that was quite good.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think this is a good point to sum everything up. This has been the first episode of the Leftynet podcast. I hope everybody here has enjoyed it, and I hope everybody watching has enjoyed it.
Listening.
Yeah, everybody listening has enjoyed it. This will hopefully be very regularly uploaded, and hopefully we will have many more episodes to come. Thank everybody. I thank everybody for listening to this, and everybody for showing
Yes.
up. All right.
Yeah, that's a great time.